Brother, let me begin by asking all of us, have we ever had to change our plans for maybe something that we had been working on for weeks or maybe even months? For example, have any ever had to change your plans, say maybe for the Feast of Tabernacles? Maybe it was a hurricane that went through and the building where you were going to be keeping services was blown totally, completely away. That's drastic, I understand, but it did happen. And here's the thing, brother, any way we look at it, change hurts. I mean, all too often change equals stress and, well, maybe more work. And it is one of those topics that no one wants to talk about. And yet, it is a big topic, very important topic in God's Word. Because you see, when we really get down to the nitty-gritty of the topic, what we begin to realize and what we begin to learn is that it is a topic about who really is in charge. So I have entitled this sermon, Who is Really in Charge? Now, with this in mind, I want you to go with me to Proverbs chapter 16. In Proverbs chapter 16, King Solomon addresses this topic and begins to tell us very plainly that God is totally in charge. And God, sometimes, maybe even often, changes our plans. So I have two questions to ask here, which is really the entirety of the sermon is based around. And the first one is, why would he do that? And the second one was, what should be my reaction and my attitude when he does it? So, go with me to Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 9. Proverbs 16 and verse 9. In his heart a man plans his course, but the Lord determines his steps. We need to realize, while it is actually normal and it is even good for us to make certain plans, we need to recognize that our future plans may seem right to us and yet maybe not so much. We need to ask ourselves, do we really believe this? Do we really believe this verse? And if we believe this verse 9 that we just read, then do we really believe God is good in the way he establishes our steps? I mean, okay, so we can concede, okay, God's in charge, okay, he gets to do this. But when he does it, is he really got the best interest of me and in mind when he does this? Think about it this way. It can be difficult, maybe even devastating to us at times when God, our words, ruins our plans. I mean, after all, think about it. We were sure that we were where we were supposed to be. And yet, all too often, brethren, the problem is, deep down inside, we think we know best. I mean, it's my life. I know more about me than what needs to happen here than anybody else. And it is what we tend to think as humans. I mean, after all, we know what we need to do, and we know when we need to do it, or at least that's what we tend to think. And so, brethren, as a result of that kind of thinking, a war begins in our minds and our hearts over who will rule our life. Us or God. And when we get down to it, we have to admit that God rules sovereign. That he is always good and that he is always right. So I ask again, why would he do that? I want us to stay here in Proverbs 16, and let's go up to verse 1, Proverbs 16 and verse 1. Fill in some details about where we're going in verse 9 that we read, that he's in charge of our steps. Proverbs 16:1, the preparations of the heart in man and the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. So very clear from the beginning of this chapter of this Proverbs, we see this. All the ways of a man are clear in his own eyes. Some translations say right. All the ways of a man are right in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the spirits, the attitudes, what our reaction is. And he kind of summarizes this by dropping down all the way into verse 25, Proverbs 16:25. There is a way that seems right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Wow. Wow. Now, if we believe the Bible, and why would we be here if we don't? So, because we believe the Bible, he just blew all of our human thinking right out of the water. Of course we need to look to God in everything, because we know he's in charge. We know that he is sovereign. We know that he is always good, and we know that he is always right. Because our ways are going to lead us to death. That's what he just told us. The point is, God changes our plans to his plans, resulting in something much better than we could ever hope for. I mean, think about it this way. Isn't this exactly what Jesus did with his own disciples? He teaches us so many lessons from what he taught to the disciples. We don't think about it in this way necessarily. Like I said, this is a big, important topic, but we don't really like to think about it so much. But this is what Jesus did. And we can read several stories about the disciples' ups and downs. We can read about their faith being developed, often being rebuked because of doubt and little faith. And we read it in the context, we go, wow, this seems so hard what Jesus just told them. And by the end of this sermon, I hope we all go look back on it and we go, it wasn't really hard at all. It really was, who's in charge? So with this in mind, go with me to Matthew chapter 8. Matthew 8, and we're going to read verses 26 and 27. Matthew 8:26. And he, Jesus, said unto them, Why are you fearful, O you of little faith? Now, I'm jumping right into the middle of the story. Very quickly, we're going to understand. Then he rose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. This is when he was in a boat. Most of these guys were fishermen. They lived out on the seas, in the waters. They knew stuff. And this storm comes up, and he's asleep. And they are fearful, and they come to him and waking him up, and he says, why are you so fearful, O you of little faith? Really? What would your reaction be if you're thinking you're about to die because of this wind is so hard, so strong, the boat is about to capsize, and he's asleep, and they wake him up, do something, and he said, oh, you of little faith. And then verse 27, and the men marvel, saying, what manner of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him? And that's really the answer. He's in charge. In Matthew chapter 16, this is still later in their journey, the disciples are still struggling somewhat with who Jesus really is. Matthew 16, verse 5. Matthew 16, verse 5. And when his disciples would come to the other side, they had forgotten to take bread. Then Jesus said unto them, take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees. And they reasoned among themselves, he's saying this because we took no bread. Which when Jesus perceived, he said unto them, O you of little faith, why reason you among yourselves because you have brought no bread? Do you not yet understand? Now, there's a whole message in do you not yet understand? They had been with him. They had seen him. And we didn't go through all the miracles. We could go through all the miracles and all the things that they saw. And he says, do you not yet understand? And then he gives them a call to mind remembrance. And he said, don't you remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000 and how many baskets you took up? And then what about the 7 loaves of the 4,000 and how many baskets you took up? Don't you remember that? How is it that you do not understand that I speak it not to you concerning bread, that you should beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Why don't you understand this? Then understood they how that he bade them not beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine of the teachings of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And it continues. It continues with a very important dialogue between Jesus and the disciples when Jesus starts asking them some questions. Verse 13, who do people say the Son of Man is? In other words, who do they say that I am? And then they give some common everyday answers that is going around from a perceived understanding about Old Testament prophecies for telling something about the coming of Messiah in verse 14. And they said, well, some say that you were John the Baptist, and some say you were Elijah, and some say you were Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And then Jesus focuses on their belief. And this is where Peter makes a very interesting statement. Now, you're going to say, okay, what does this got to do with? Because it culminates in a very interesting point. Matthew 16, verse 15. And he said unto them, but whom say you that I am? Who do they say I am? Well, they say that. Okay, but who do you say I am? The living God. That's what Peter tells him. Peter realized something here and proclaimed it, and we very clearly see why he came to this, that Jesus was the prophesied Messiah. And then Peter is attaching his hopes and his dreams to Jesus. And all of that is great. All of this is good. And then Jesus publicly proclaims that what Peter is saying is correct, and he blesses Peter. Matthew 16, verse 17. And Jesus answered and said unto him, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, son of John. For flesh and blood has not revealed this unto you, but my Father which is in heaven. So he's saying, God gave you that. And it's a blessing on you because you listened and you understood it, you received it, and you publicly proclaimed it. So I'm proclaiming it here that this is what you did. And I say unto you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. And then we could go through all of this. And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, the church, and all of that. And you know this. And you shall bind on earth, and you shall loose on earth what it shall be loosed in heaven, is how it ends. So let me ask you a question here about Peter. Do you think maybe that he was thinking about the defeating and removing the Roman army who was occupying the area? I mean, after all, this was a common expectation of the Messiah. It's just a question because we don't know the answer. So I think that we would be actually shocked at Peter's plans. This is where we get down to the topic. When Jesus started to foretell about his own death, about Jesus' death. Verse 21. We're still in Matthew 16:27. From that time forth, Jesus began to show his disciples how that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and be raised again the third day. And what do we see here? Well, we find that Peter became so upset with what Jesus is telling them about his death that he takes Jesus aside to rebuke him. Verse 22, this shall never happen to you. Now, I think we can read between the lines what Peter's actually saying. That is not my plan. And Jesus' response is, well, to say the least, stinging. I mean, Jesus associated Peter's plan with Satan. With Satan perverting God's plan and God's way of salvation. And then it's in verse 23 that we see the reason for Jesus' rebuke. In verse 23, but he, Jesus, turned into Peter, Get you behind me, Satan. You are an offense unto me, for you savor not the things that are of God, but those things of men. In other words, you do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of man. Or your focus is on not God's plan, but on your plan. And I think, brethren, what we all need to realize, this statement reveals the true issue that is at the center of Jesus' rebuke or statement. Whose plan do you operate by? Is it man's thoughts or God's thoughts? Now, all of this ties in with why does he do that? Remember I said the whole sermon is based around those two questions. Thoughts and our focus. Go with me to Isaiah 55 and verse 8. Now, most of you are going to know this first, but let's look at it in this context. Isaiah 55 verse 8. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. And what we need to understand here is that this is describing the thoughts and ways of the unconverted. And a very big point that we need to realize, this is not the way that we are to stay. If we're dealing with God, if we're dealing with Jesus, if we're dealing with God's way of life, because we have been called by the Father and He's given us over to Jesus and we're submitting to Him, that verse should not apply to our lives. Our plans are what God has in mind. It is no reason to even speculate and to any wonder that Jesus immediately describes the conditions of being a disciple, a follower of Jesus and Jesus' way of life. And as we can see, and I should have told you to hold your place, we're going to go back to Matthew 16. In verse 24, Jesus insists that if anyone has the plans to follow Him, He said, I want to know. Back in Matthew 16:24, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. In the context of the sermon, now the verses do not say this, but it certainly is in the scope of the sense of the verses in this context. You have to deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me. In other words, your plans have to become my plans. In other words, let's do it the other way. My plans have to become your plans. What I have in mind, that's what you should be having in mind. And brother, hopefully, this is beginning to be clear. The point that following Jesus requires a change in our plans. I mean, as believers, we must give up. We must relinquish. We must deny our own desire to plan and insist on our way of thoughts and doing things through daily surrendering our life to Jesus Christ. There is no other way. I mean, think about it this way. Even though we know that God has offered through Jesus Christ, salvation has been offered to us, and I think we can even say, if you really think about it, if we're a true believer and follower of Jesus Christ, our salvation is even secured through our Lord and our Savior, Jesus Christ. Yet the struggle to make Jesus our Lord, our boss, to make Him the one who is totally in charge of our life, that's a continuously constant giving up of our plans for God's plans. we must daily focus our mind on God's thoughts, including His plans for our life. What if we're very sick, bedridden? Yeah, we could talk about, well, somebody who's elderly, that's, the aging process. We're living at the end of, close to the end of 6,000 years of degeneracy of man. That's pretty common. But what if you're, say, 40? And you're living with a condition that wasn't really part of your plan, but you have this condition because, say, maybe abuse. How do we react to that? The answer is very simple. It's just living it out. The answer is God's in charge. Yeah, there are physical things we do and we need to do, and we need to do all of those kinds of things, but God's in charge. God's in charge, and He's good, and He's always good, and He's always right. Brethren, please understand, that is why when God changes our plans, we must refocus our mind and our thoughts asking, what does He have in mind for this moment in my life, in our life? Because it's not just mine, it's all of us. What does He have in mind? Why is He doing this? Well, we need to be able to focus on God's thoughts because they will spare us the stress of worrying about things that are outside of our control in the first place. And that's a huge thing for the human mind and thinking to come to grips with. So in other words, we need to learn how to not waste time on worrying or being anxious on what we've lost. And by loss, I mean our plans. But rather, we need to start realizing God's plan will allow for something better to happen. The question that we all have to ask ourselves is, do I believe this? It's easy for me to get up here and make the statement, because I 100% believe that I can prove this out of Scripture. But that doesn't make it easy to believe it. So do we believe it? That's the point. And brethren, the benefit of keeping God's thoughts in our focus also includes, less grief. When we experience a change in plans, as we live with hope, knowing God's best is coming because it is His plan that we are now living. But it's not going the way I want it to go. Then change the way we want it to go. Go the way God wants us to go. Get in line there. I'm not saying this is an easy thing. I'm saying it's a realistic thing whenever we look at this topic. Therefore, when we realize who is really in charge in our life, and then we humble ourselves to His thoughts and His way of life, therefore, when God changes our plans, look for His blessing of something new and exciting and unexpected. I mean, Even though we may consider our plan to be lost to us, that's the way we tend to think about it, God's love and grace and mercy is sufficient to carry us into his next step for our life. Even if it's in this life, the ending, even if it goes as far as the ending of a physical life, and this is carried out in the resurrection. As I said, this really is a huge and important topic. So now I want us to kind of shift a little, not exactly, but still the same topic. But I want us to take a look at the example of the life of Paul. We know Paul. We know he had plans, and we know that he was on the road to Damascus, and we know his plans were not in line with the plans of God. How do we know? Because God altered his plans. I mean, that's the point. So with that in mind, please go with me to Acts chapter 22. The event took place in 9, but he's retelling it in Acts 22. And we're going to begin in verse 4. Acts 22, verse 4. And I persecuted this way of life unto death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women. He's describing what he did. That was my plan. That's what I was doing. I was executing my plan. This is what he's saying. As also the high priest does bear we witness, and all the estate of the elders, from whom also I've received letters unto the brethren, and went to Damascus to bring them which were bound unto Jerusalem for to be punished. That's my plan. And it came to pass that as I made my journey, and was come nigh unto Damascus, it was about noon, suddenly there shone from heaven a great light round about me, and I fell on the ground. And I heard a voice saying unto me, Saul, Saul, why persecute you me? And I answered, Who are you, Lord? And he said unto me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you persecute. And he says, those that were with me saw indeed the light and were afraid, but they heard not the voice of him that spoke. And then we carefully notice what is stated in verse 10. And I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said unto me, Arise and go into Damascus, and there it shall be told unto you all the things which are appointed for you to do. Paul had plans, and God dramatically changed his plans. And here's the point. Brethren, we need to also base our lives upon the question, two-part question here that was asked by Saul/Paul. Who are you, and what do you want me to do, Lord? And so I ask, was this by chance that he was suddenly converted? And I used that word, I think it's a good word to use there, on the road to Damascus? Or was it according to God's plan and God's purpose? Was it just chance, or was it God's plan in mind? Acts chapter 9 in verse 15 actually tells us very clearly that it was according to plan. God's plan. For he is a chosen vessel unto me, to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. So we see God changed Paul's plan to God's plan that God had in mind for him. And I know we tend to think, yeah, but that was Paul, that's not me. But brethren, the question we need to ask here is, what about me? I mean, does God have a plan for my life? And put your name there. And if the answer is yes, then how do we know what it is? What is involved in finding what it is, the plan that God has for my life? I understand, and I know that you do as well. These are very demanding questions, and they demand answers, and there are others like this. And here's what I'm saying. God has a definite plan and purpose for the life of every one of his children. I believe that. I believe the scriptures show us that plainly. In fact, there are some very strong reasons for us to believe this is true. I mean, consider, I think it's reasonable for us to expect it. God is not a respecter of persons. He did this for Saul/Paul. He did it for others. He did it for Peter. You know. We have several verses in the pages of the Bible to show that this is true. I'm going to read just one here. There are many others. In fact, I actually listed out, and I had like 12, I think I had 12 or 13 of them, and I just stopped writing out verses. But I want to read one here. It's in Psalm 33, verse 11. There are others, they're good, and we're going to read some a little bit later. And this is from the NIV. Psalm 33:11, where it states, "But the plans of the Lord stand firm forever. The purposes of his heart through all generations." If he's got a plan to do it, you know what? It's going to happen. It's going to happen. Not what is us. Sometimes we reason, he can't expect me to do that. So I want to go back and ask the two questions that we asked earlier. Why does he do that? And what should be our reaction when he does? Well, with that in mind, I want us to consider some points in trying to answer these two, I believe, very important questions that we all need to ask ourselves. And I say some points. There are many others. I've kind of just limited to these that I have. The first point, and first of all, is we are not God. I mean, remember earlier I stated it becomes a war in our minds and our hearts over who will rule our life, us or God? What we need to know, what we need to think about, what we need to realize is that we are not sovereign. We're not in charge, no matter how much we may want to be. 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 7. 2 Corinthians 4 verse 7. I'm going to read this from the NIV. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. I think the very first thing that we need to realize in answering these two questions, first one is, we are not God. Point number two is, God is. He is in charge. God is sovereign. Sovereignty means loosely means the authority to rule. And the point that we pretty much all realize, or at least need to realize, is that God has no limits. I mean, there is nothing outside his control. Not even our situations, our situations that we face daily. Not our relationships with one another, not our family, nothing. Nothing. There is nothing outside of his control because he is God. He rules sovereign. I ran across this quote. Surprising that I have a quote. I find it very interesting. There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine. It belongs to me. That's what he's saying. This is the quote. Very appropriate. Please go with me to Job 42 verse 2. Job 42 verse 2. I know that you can do some things. Is that what it says? I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. That's the God we worship. And I don't want him to make the plans for my life? Really? Think about it this way. Everything belongs to him. Everything. I mean, he made everything. And therefore, because of that, I think it's pretty logical for us to conclude if he made everything, then he gets to decide how everything works. If he changes our plans, and I'm using this thing, changes our plans, I'm talking about what I want. Whatever that is. If he changes our plans, what I'm wanting, brethren, it is because I think about it as simple as we can state it. It's because he knows things that we do not know. I mean, there's a verse that says he knows the end from the beginning. He knows everything. How many of us know everything? And I have a whole list of scriptures, and I can read these off that talks about that he has these plans for us, that he's in charge, that he's because he's God. And I'm not going to read these. I'm just going to go down the list, and if you get them, great. If you don't, you can look them up yourself. That's what I did. Deuteronomy 10, verse 14. Deuteronomy 29:29. Psalm 24, verse 1 and 2. Psalm 139, verse 7 through 12. Psalm 50, verse 10. Hebrews 2, verse 10. James 1, verse 17. 1 Corinthians 12, 1 through 11. 2 Corinthians 9, 10 and 11. And that's just some. That's just some. Therefore, I state again, because he made everything, it's logical for us to conclude that he gets to decide how everything works. Even our life. Because point 2 is he is God. Number 3, God is always good. Coming to realize that God is in control, that he is sovereign, that he knows things that we do not know. It sounds so simple to state it, brethren, but we need to recognize and we need to admit it. That is a very important realization. Psalm 34 and verse 8. Psalm 34, verse 8. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man that trusts in him. So point number 3 that I've got, God is always good. And I didn't state this, and he's always right. And the 4th point, and I only have 4, I said these are just some. There are others. Number 4, God does everything. God does everything for our good. Do we believe that is true? Romans 8:28. Romans 8:28. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God. And that's the key. Do we love God? To him who are the called according to his purpose, what he has in mind. Jeremiah 29:11. A lot of you will have this as a memory verse. Jeremiah 29:11. I'm going to read this from the Amplified Bible. For I know the plans and thoughts that I have for you, says the Lord. Plans of peace and well-being and not for disaster. To give you a future and a hope. Wow. And I want to tell him, get your hand off of my life. Let me do what I want to do. Really? I mean, you know. These are just some of the reasons why God does what he does, including our plans. Therefore, our action, our attitude, which is question number 2, what should our attitude and our actions be? Our action, our attitude needs to be, at least symbolically, I thought about asking every one of you to write out on the paper what you thought the answer is, what you would say is the answer. I know what I've said, but do you know what you would say? Well, let me give you mine. You can think about it. Therefore, our action and our attitude needs to be one of falling flat on our face, stretched out before Him as low as we can get, thanking Him, praising Him for who and what He is, because if we get to this place, it is because we have come to realize how much He really loves us and how much He wants us. And we know that He's really the one in charge. And we're thankful and appreciative for that very statement. And brethren, any way you want to look at it, that is an awesome truth to know. Who is really in charge? It's one thing to say, well, of course God is. But to come through some of this, the answer, it could be the very same answer, but it takes on a whole different meaning. When we look at it, I think this way. And aren't we glad that He is? The Aaronic blessing. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, speak unto Aaron and to his sons, saying, on this wise ye shall bless the children of Israel, saying unto them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace. And they shall put my name upon the children of Israel, and I will bless them. With this sermon in mind, we have to see how important this Aaronic blessing really is in the lives of each one of us, collectively and individually. God bless you all. Happy Sabbath. He loves you. And brethren, please know I love all of you also very much. God bless you all.